Hello class. Today we are going to be continuing our journey through communist thought. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain Marx's idea of what capitalism does to human society and links Marx's communism to Locke's ultimate endorsement of capitalism or capitalist consequences. So a couple review questions just to remind you where we left off last time. Okay, so Marx, when he's talking about exploitation, he's saying that the workers don't own what they make, and the reason they don't own what they make is because of the bourgeoisie. So the question is this exploitation and this pursuit of profit the natural order of things? Is this the way human society is supposed to behave? Because we need to know that if we're going to try and decide if it deserves to be fixed and what that solution could look like. So in order to know if this is natural, we have to go back to philosophers who talked about what humans are naturally like. And we're going to go back and look at John Locke to understand Karl Marx. If you remember, John Locke is one of our liberal philosophers from the Enlightenment. Liberal, again, meaning endorses the idea of individual rights. For Locke, those are life, liberty, and property. He's also the philosopher that said you had the right to revolt if your government was infringing on those rights in a significant way. So we're going to look at Locke, not because he's the only person who has this philosophy or this theory of a state of nature, but because he's the one that Marx is going to be most influenced by. So, just like we had Cicero talking to, or Machiavelli talking to Cicero, we're going to see Marx talking to Locke, even though Locke will be dead, just like Cicero was dead by the time the later philosophers were engaging with their work. So, Locke has this idea of a state of nature, which is what it sounds like, man's natural state at the start of humanity. Crucially, this is before the creation of government. Right? So government doesn't exist, but humans do. What are people like? Locke said that at the very beginning of everything, God hath given the world to men in common. Essentially what this means is that Locke, being a Christian, believes in God. He thinks God made the world, and he gave it to people to share. Right? In common means to share. So that means the question is, if we're talking about property here and ownership and wealth gaps, the question becomes, okay, if God gave the earth to all of humanity to share, then how did we wind up with private property? How do we have people owning individual plots of land and houses and businesses and things like that? So Locke continues to walk us through this. He says, every man hath or has property in his own person, and the work of his hands, we may say, is properly his. So, what's the first thing that people own in this world? They own themselves. They own their own person, their own body. They own themselves. And therefore, they own the work of whatever their body does. In this case, anything you work on. So, whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and mixed his labor with, and join to it something that is his own, thereby makes it his property. That excludes the common right of other men. So if you work on something, you take it out of the state of nature, you find a seed, and you plant that seed, and you cultivate that seed, and you water it, and you protect it, and you watch it grow into an apple tree, well, now that's your apple tree because you, even though you found the seed in nature, and anybody could have taken that seed because it was given to the world to share, but you plucked it out of nature and you did something with it. And you used your own body that you own to work on it. If you've heard the expression, I put my blood, sweat, and tears into that, that's essentially what Locke is saying. You're putting an extension of yourself through your labor, through your hard work, into this thing, and therefore it becomes part of you, and you own you. So now you can own this thing. Right? And so now other people can't come along, this last part here, and just claim that they have it now. That, oh, look, I found this apple tree. Well, no, you didn't, because I grew that apple tree. So now that apple tree is mine, and those apples are mine. And you can go walking through the forest, and you can pick some other apples from off some other tree, but not my apples that I grew. Okay? That is his theory. So you get to own things privately because you worked on them, according to Locke. And again, Marx is going to be looking at Locke when he is making his own theory of communism. So, are there any limits to how much you can own in this state of nature? Again, what is a state of nature? Before the government. So, are there limits to how many seeds you can take and plant and cultivate, how many apples you can pick? Well, Locke says yes, there is a limit, even though there's no government to set a limit. He says there's a natural limit that God kind of implies. He says you can take as much as you want from what's public, right? So not from somebody, if they grew an apple tree, you can't take that apple tree. But if there's just a bunch of apples out in the forest or in a natural orchard, then you can take those. That's fine. As long as you use it all before it spoils. So Locke is thinking of a world where there's no scarcity. He's not like our philosopher Hobbes, where everything is scarce and you have to fight for the little bit that's available. Locke in the 1600s, he's envisioning the Americas, which Europeans have recently showed up to, and he's hearing about all this land and all these natural riches. And so in his mind, the world before governments was full of bountiful resources and there wasn't scarcity. And so there wasn't a limit to what you could take because there wasn't enough. There was a limit because it was wasteful to take more than you could use. And if you're taking more than you can use and it goes bad, then you're essentially stealing it from other people who could have had it. So if you pick all these apples and you pile them up and you don't eat them all and they start to rot, well, other people could have picked those apples and eaten it. And so it's like you've stolen from them, even though nobody actually owned those apples. That is his philosophy. So is there a natural limit then to the wealth gap in the state of nature? Could we have a wealth gap in the state of nature? Yeah, you could have a wealth gap if we start with our familiar graph here where we have wealth and over time, how much wealth is somebody accumulating. You could have person A, Bob, decide he wants to collect a whole bunch of apples, and then person B, Sally, be like, nah, not really, I'm not going to collect that many apples. And so there is a gap here between the wealth of apples that they possess. But how long is that gap really going to last? What happens to apples? Either they get eaten or they go bad. So in the end of the year, right, you're going to wind up with the apples either being eaten or going bad. And they're both going to wind up back where they started with no apples. And so they're at an equal starting point again. And then the next season, Sally could say, I was kind of hungry last season. I'm going to work harder and I'm going to get more apples. And Bob can be like, yeah, I had too many apples last season, or I just don't feel like working that hard. I'm trying to lose some weight, whatever. And he's not going to collect as many apples. And so again, we have our wealth gap here. There is a gap. But is it going to last multiple generations? No, it's going to go back to the starting point at the end of the season when the apples either are eaten or rot because they don't last forever. So how do we get from this, where we have a wealth gap each season, but then it goes back to zero? It does not go from generation to generation, to what we have covered and what we're familiar with, which is children being able to inherit from their parents. And we see this intergenerational wealth gap being created. How do we get there? And would Locke be okay with it? Well, let's look at what he says. So Locke says, men have agreed to the disproportionate, so uneven, and unequal possession of the earth. So they've agreed to this inequality that we just saw here. He's saying that this is something that men have agreed to. How do they do that? By having by tacit and voluntary consent found out a way how a man may fairly possess more land than he himself can use the product of. So they figured out some way implicitly, so they didn't have to actually go outright and say it or sign a contract, but through their actions, they have voluntarily showed that they consent to having this inequality, to actually owning more than they can even use. How did they do that? By receiving in exchange for the surplus gold and silver, which may be hoarded up without injury to anyone. Basically, they started exchanging, instead of exchanging corn for apples, they started exchanging silver and gold. They started using money. And what is the chief advantage of money? That's that it doesn't go bad, right? Apples will rot. gold coins don't rot. It's really what it's chiefly useful for. Gold isn't a super valuable material. It's not super useful. It's kind of a soft metal. You can't really build a lot of stuff out of it. But it doesn't go bad, so you can use it to signify your wealth. You can use it to exchange for things that you want because it's not going to go bad. Right? And so because of that, you can see that we wind up with this inherited wealth, because the kids of the people who, say we had Bob here, who was really industrious, and he was growing apples, but then he had so many extra apples, he was able to sell those apples in exchange for coins that don't go bad. Because remember, Locke only said you couldn't take more than you could use, that it would spoil. Well, money doesn't spoil, so if he's taking huge chunks of territory and creating a whole big apple orchard and growing more apples than he could use, but he's selling those apples for coins, well, the coins don't go bad, so he can stack those up all he wants, and they will last through his kid's lifetime and his grandkid's lifetime and his great-grandkids and so on and so forth, and his family can continue to inherit this wealth even though they didn't actually necessarily work on those apples to grow those apples, but they were just able to inherit the coins that their great-great-great-grandfather earned by growing and selling those apples. Locke is going to say that this wealth gap, as a result, is perfectly fine. That it's okay to have stuff that you didn't work on if you inherited it from somebody who did, because it was their money, so they can choose what to do with it. It's their property, and if they want to give it to their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, they can do that. If they want to give it away, they can do that. It's their money. And so this wealth gap is okay because when people started using money, they must have known this was going to be the outcome, because the whole point of money is that it doesn't spoil. So obviously it was going to last longer than your lifetime. And nobody forced you to start using money. So if you started using it, and now we continue to use money, even down here where we're in great-great-great-grandkid territory, then therefore people must be okay with this wealth gap. And so you can't complain about it because you didn't have to start using money, but you did. And this is the consequence of that. So this is the way things are. Okay? So that's going to be Locke's theory about how we get from things being commonly owned and there being natural limits to how much you can have, to what we'll see by the time he's writing in the 1600s. Obviously, you have a wealthy class and a poor class, and he says that's totally fine, right? It's totally fine. Marx is not going to be so okay with it, right? So we have Marx is going to say, okay, we've got these two groups of people, right? Got these two groups of people. He labels the top group the bourgeoisie, which we've talked about. This is the moneyed, landed elite. These are the people who own the means of production. These are the very, very wealthy people. And then he's going to label a new class, the working class, a new term that we didn't already cover. They're called the proletariat. Proletariat. That's very important to understanding communism. It's a huge buzzword for communism. Bourgeoisie, proletariat. And he's going to say that over time, if you let this run out long enough, over generation after generation after generation, you keep going, he says, Marx says, these are the only two groups that are going to exist. There will not be a middle class, an artisan class, a merchant class, no mom and pop shops, little small businesses. Those are not going to exist anymore because the super rich will be able to buy them out, right? Think of big corporations putting little restaurants, little shops out of business, okay? It's very topical for what's going on in the world right now. So he says that those big companies, because they have so many advantages and they have so much money, can put those little mom and pop shops out of business. This is how Blockbuster used to work. They'd come in, and because they're a big company, they would, this is a movie renting business before Netflix, they would lower their prices for rental really low, so people would go there instead of the mom and pop shop, and then they'd put the mom and pop shop out of business, and then they would raise their prices once you didn't have anywhere else to go, right? And then Netflix came along and put Blockbuster out of business. But that's what he's saying, that these big companies, the wealthy, are going to basically be able to create monopolies, buy up all these independent little businesses, and so you will no longer have a middle class. You're only going to have a bourgeoisie and a proletariat. So what is the name of the working class? The proletariat. in this graph, which group is the top line? The top line would be our bourgeoisie, and the bottom line would be whom? The proletariat. Right? So all these things coming together, right? Because Marx is writing at a time when this is what he sees happening in the 1800s with unrestricted capitalism, and he's looking at a philosopher that talked about natural rights, but also talked about a philosophy that justified this development, right? Marx is going to be reading Locke, and he's going to be on board with Locke up until the point where he says this is okay. Marx says that this is not a natural or acceptable way to structure society. Absolutely not. He thinks this is very unnatural and causing lots of problems for people. So let's look at the three key ways he thinks capitalism changes human life. Okay, so if humans are naturally social and friendly and work together, what does he think happens under capitalism? What are humans acting like under capitalism? Humans are competing with one another. The bourgeoisie are competing with the proletariat, trying to pay them as little as possible, and the proletariat want to get paid more and be treated better and safer working conditions. The bourgeoisie are also competing with other bourgeoisie because you've got business owners competing with each other, right, trying to put each other out of business. And then you've got the proletariat competing with one another. This is why wages are so low, for example. People are competing with each other for jobs, and they're driving down their wages. If Bob needs a job and Sally needs a job, well, Bob says, I'll work for $1 an hour, and Sally's like, I really need this job. Okay, I'll work for 99 cents an hour. And then Timmy comes along, and he's like, I'll work for 98 cents an hour. And Susie comes along, and she's like, well, I'll work for 97 cents an hour. And before you know it, you're working for like 5 cents an hour, because there's so many people competing for these jobs, and the bourgeoisie, they're not highly skilled jobs, so the bourgeoisie can pretty quickly train you, and so you don't have a whole lot of bargaining power, right? So people are getting very competitive, right, and stressed out. Marx says, he agrees with Locke and says the worker naturally owns what she makes, right? In the natural world, you own what you make. That was the whole bit about owning what you work on and extending yourself into your product. Well, in nature, therefore, you would be able to decide what you do. If you made a chair, you could decide what to do with that chair. Do you want to keep it? Do you really like it? Do you sell it? If you have these apples, do you want to eat them? Do you want to sell them? It's your thing, so you can decide who to sell it to, whether or not to sell it, if you want to trade it for something, if you want to keep it, whatever, okay? In capitalism, does the worker own what they make? Who owns what the worker makes in capitalism? The business owner, right? The CEO. This was our whole example with the bar where we divided it up into 10 parts and we were making sneakers, right? And I think it was Bob and Sally, and Bob was the owner, and he got to keep the sneakers and decide what to sell them for, right? The business owns what you make. The CEO owns what the workers make. Okay? According to Marx, people in the natural world, before all this businesses and government and capitalism, people enjoyed working, right? They did it for fun, for personal fulfillment. It's what separates people from animals. He says that people are naturally creative, and before people were forced to work, they liked to do it. Under capitalism, why do people work? People are forced to work to survive, right? And Marx says that that is like animals. That, why does a wolf hunt? To eat, to survive. Why do bees make honey? To survive. But they don't do it for like artistic reasons. And he says at this point in capitalism, people are working to survive. They're working long hours to make enough money to pay rent and feed themselves, right? We got 5-year-olds working in factories so that they can eat. That has turned humans into animals. I want you to take a moment to think about what Marx is saying people are like naturally, and whether or not you agree with this. Do you think humans are naturally social and work together? Do you think they enjoy working? Some of you might be thinking, well, humans aren't always social and friendly and working together. Like that, they like to compete. They are often very competitive. They want to one-up each other. Marx would say that was because you're thinking of somebody in a capitalist society. You're only thinking about people you know, and you're living in a capitalist society, in a world where capitalism has taken hold. And it's cultivated this competitiveness. But that in nature, any sort of competitiveness would be in good faith. It would be for fun, and it's not deep-seated competitive nature. He'd be thinking of things like social pack animals, right? Like wolves working together to take down a larger prey. You're cooperative. Like, monkeys getting along. He'd be thinking about how, and you might be able to relate to this, when people are isolated, when they don't get to spend time with other people, they get depressed and anxious, and it's really hard for them because we're naturally social creatures. You could be arguing that, well, okay, but maybe people don't really enjoy working. Like, who wants to work? We want to just relax. And Marx would say, well, that's only because you're being forced to do things you don't want to do in order to survive because of capitalism. That in a world where you're your own boss, where you get to do whatever you want to do, you would quickly get tired of just sitting around. And again, in what's going on right now, you might be able to relate to this, that without something to keep you occupied, you're kind of bored and it gets depressing. That you have that if people weren't so tired at the end of the day because they're being forced to spend all their time working to survive in offices or as cashiers or whatever it is they're doing, or if you weren't so tired from being forced to go to school and learn about things you don't want to do, you would become curious about things you are interested in, and you would pursue that, and you would develop hobbies. I mean, any of you who have hobbies, like if you like anything you'd like to do that's creative, so this could be working on music or painting or knitting or carpentry or writing or whatever it is, if it's a creative thing that you're creating something, he would say that that is work, but it's something that you are doing because you want to. And if you had time and you weren't so exhausted from having to do all the stuff you don't want to do, you would spend your time doing that. And that is the proof that he's right about human nature and how capitalism corrupts human nature. You could think about just the way people go about creating things. People like to put their own personal touches on things. So if you're thinking like in architecture, the homes you live in or the school building you go to, there's all these little touches to try and make things look nice, which are not actually necessary, but people like to put their personal touches on things. Okay. So he's saying, really, people were much happier in the state of nature. And in this, he kind of agrees with Locke, because Locke was saying things along these lines, but that where Marx diverges from Locke is he says now people are miserable and it's because of capitalism, and this is the problem. It's the exploitation, forcing people to work because they're being paid so little in jobs that they don't like, that they have no control over because they don't know what they make, because they're working on things that they don't own. The means of production is owned by the CEO and the business, so they don't get to own what they make, so they don't get to put in their own personal touches and be creative. Maybe you wouldn't mind making sneakers all day if you got to be creative with it, but you don't get to be creative with it, right? You can see this with like chairs. Think about how many ways humans have designed chairs. It's not necessary. What you need is a seat and four legs, but we come up with all kinds of different chairs to sit in, the uncomfortable ones that you sit in at school all the time, what you probably sitting at home at your kitchen table, at a desk chair. You've got this creativity where somebody designed a scorpion chair. I mean, is that necessary? No, it's creative because people like to be creative. And that's what separates us from animals. And so in taking this away and not allowing people to own what they make, and therefore be creative with it and have control over the thing that's an extension of themselves, so they put their labor into it and their creativity into it, therefore you're turning them into animals. They're turning them into just little worker bees. So the problem with all this is that Locke himself says that people have the rights of life, liberty, and property stems from owning what you make, owning yourself, and owning what you put into something, that these rights are inalienable. If something is alienable, it's outside of you. Think of like a space alien comes from outside of Earth. So it can be taken away. Alienation means separation. But inalienable, therefore, means it cannot be taken away. So Locke says you can't take away people's rights to life, liberty, and property. This is something you're familiar with. Marx is looking at this saying, okay, Locke, you wrote this book about the fact that all people have these inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. You can't take those rights away. And yet under capitalism, is property inalienable? do the people in living under a capitalist system, do they get their right to property? Do the workers specifically have their right to property? No, because the workers don't own what they make. They don't own what they extend their labor into, and they're supposed to own their labor. And they don't. It gets taken by the bourgeoisie. So, I want you to think about everything we've been talking about. The reason we've been doing Locke with Marx is because Marx is talking to Locke. He's using Locke's arguments against him. So how is it that Locke is using his own, or Marx is using Locke's arguments against him? He's doing this by saying, Marx is saying Locke is contradicting himself. He's saying you can't say, Locke, that the right to property comes from what you work on, and that the right to property can't be taken away, while you're also saying that it's okay to have an entire system built on the fact that workers don't own what they work on, and people own things they don't work on. The bourgeoisie gets to own stuff that workers made, or that their great-great-great-great-grandparents made. They essentially, Locke's arguing that you should own what you make, but also it's okay that workers don't own what they make. Marx is saying that that's a major problem, because Locke is talking against what he just said, right? He's contradicting himself. So this is where Marx's major critique of capitalism and of Locke himself comes from. This is it. He says Locke's theory is illogical because it endorses this huge wealth gap that is unnatural, and he's the very person who explained what was natural to begin with, okay? And it all comes down to who owns what and the right to property and the workers being exploited, which again means they don't own what they make. So, I want to walk you through now 4 more results of capitalism that will wrap up our foundation of where communism is coming from, so that we can then look at what Marx's solution to all of this is. The social results of capitalism. We've got 4 results, okay? So first we see that capitalism creates what's called coerced labor. If somebody is coercing you to do something, they're forcing you to do it, usually through threat or blackmail, right? So here, coerced labor means that workers are forced to work in order to survive. They're not choosing to work in these factories because they want to. They have to have a job to survive, and these are the jobs that are available. So examples here would be homework versus hobbies, right? I coerce you into doing your homework because I make it worth points. And if you don't do it, you won't pass the class. So that's me coercing you. And I do that because I don't think you would do your homework just for the fun of it, right? Whereas whatever you'd rather be doing, those hobbies, that's not coerced labor. That's you doing something because you want to do it, right? You working at a job that you hate to afford food and rent, that is coercion, okay? Because you have to do this, you don't want to. Me grading papers, that's coerced labor. I don't want to do it. I do it because I need to pay my mortgage and I want to keep my job. The part of teaching you lessons, that I like doing, and if I won like $1 billion, I would still want to teach classes. That part I like. The grading part, less so. Okay, okay, part 2. The second social result of capitalism, how capitalism affects society and people's lives. What's called the commodification of labor. A commodity is something you buy or sell. It's an item that you can buy or sell. So you might, if you pay attention to like news about the economy, you might hear something about like, oh, the commodities market was up today. Commodity is just like a thing that you can buy or sell. And so when we say commodification of labor, we're saying that workers themselves become commodities. They become things to be bought and sold. They sell themselves to businesses. And again, Marx doesn't like this because you're turning people into things. The easiest way to think about this is wage, right? Or a salary. You're being paid for your labor. You're selling your labor, which is part of you, to somebody else in exchange for money, right? So your teachers sold hours and hours and hours and hours of their life and their hard work, sometimes years of their lives, to the school district in exchange for a wage. If you work in a movie theater, you're selling the hours of your life at that movie theater to the movie theater in exchange for a wage, right? That's what's going on. Marx says that while humans naturally would produce things because they want to, because they're creative and they like to create things. In capitalism, all of that creativity is kind of stripped away, and now people are making things for profit, not for pleasure, right? You're producing goods not because anybody needs them or enjoys producing them, but so that they can be sold. Think about, how many pieces of clothing are made every year? Do we really need that many pieces of clothing in the world? No, we don't. It's being produced so that companies can sell that. Yeah, we need clothing. There's 7 billion people on the planet. But think about your closet. Do you own more clothes than you actually need? Yeah, probably, right? And this we can see through like changing fashions, the fact that fashion cycles through, and it cycles through at a frequency to constantly try and get you to buy new stuff. Usually you're being told your jeans are no longer in fashion, so you need to buy a new pair, even though the jeans you had are still perfectly good, right? And it often cycles through in a way to try and make sure that you no longer have the old thing, like, so the stuff from the 80s is now back in fashion, which is just in time for everybody to have gotten rid of the stuff from the 80s. So now they're bringing it back to get you to buy more, right? This is the purpose of ad agencies and marketing, is to try and get you to want things that you don't necessarily need, right? Okay, last bit. Marx says that these social results of capitalism are happening on a global scale. People are being exploited globally, even in countries where there's not industrialization. And we can see that through the use of colonialism. Why are the European countries and the United States going out and colonizing places? What's the motivation? They're doing this because they need resources to make all this stuff, and they're making all this stuff that people don't necessarily need in order to sell it to make a profit. So they also need markets, remember? So they're going to Africa and India and the Americas for resources, and then they're taking those resources, bringing it back to their countries, pumping it through the factories where they're paying workers really low wages and exploiting them, taking that stuff that they worked on that the workers do not own, putting it back on, then putting it in stores in their own country, like in England, but then whatever they don't sell there, they're sending it, putting on ships, and they're sending it to India or China to get them to buy those things, right? So globally, this is a global system of exploitation, capitalism, and it's causing misery worldwide. And so Marx is going to lay out a plan for how to fix all of this, his solution to what he sees as all these problems of capitalism. And he's going to lay that out in his Communist Manifesto, a short little text. He also writes much longer books about capital and capitalism, but there's a little pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto that we're going to work through that really lays out the basics of what his plan is. Communism as the solution to capitalism, what that actually looks like. And so we're going to talk about that next time. And because you can see that he has this idea that this is having global consequences, it should give you a heads up that communism is going to be a global philosophy. Okay, so when we look at it, it's not going to just be focused in the countries where you have factories. It's going to be focused on the whole world, although the starting point will be the places where you're having the exploitation of the workers in the factories. But it will have a global scope. Okay, talk to you next time.